That 5 cc bottle that a lot of clinics use has the mercury preservative. It has thimerosal. So that's going to become a hazardous waste if they have to discard it. Obviously, the single dose doesn't. Some of the manufacturers do use thimerosal in their process. Some pass, some fail. They're right on the wiggle line, so to speak. Humalog is human insulin, selenium and chromium, and then your silver sulfadiazine cream down there at the bottom. Okay, reactivity. I told you nitroglycerin came out when it's in weak medicinal forms. Because the good news is nitroglycerin medications have never exploded in living memory, which is so good from all kinds of points of view. So it was great when they took that out, because 10 years ago, or a little longer than that, it was still regulated, and that caused a lot of drugs to go into hazardous waste. Okay, here's our next challenge. Which of the following statements about you-listed drugs is false? Okay, which is false? I've only got 52 responses. Remember, this is anonymous. Take your shot. Okay, the correct answer is actually the white and blue container, because you listed as RCRA hazardous, it's usually disposed in the black container. The packaging can be disposed of as solid waste. However, I will give you a point for that, because if you were thinking of chemotherapy, and a lot of those you listed drugs are chemo, we are now telling people to manage those as trace chemotherapy in the yellow container, because they have found that they are contaminated coming from the manufacturer. That's how subtle it is. It's not a lot. So I'll give you a point for that. But they certainly are toxic. Many are chemo, and they are regulated by EPA. So, okay, these are some of the ones I mentioned earlier that we only have these 9 listed ones, P or U, and we have a lot of drugs that pharmacists would recognize here that they know are very toxic, and I think are already managing as a hazardous waste. The big shift in practice, for 20 years they've been putting these in the yellow container, thinking they were doing the right thing because it said chemotherapy waste on it, not understanding that that was a regulated medical waste, and it was going to a regulated medical waste incinerator instead of a RCRA facility. So the big shift is moving what we call bulk chemo out of the yellow into the black. So that's a change in practice. And then just to reiterate that, the trace chemo, we're telling folks it should be empty vials, empty syringes, empty IVs, gowns, gloves, anything else, wipes that are trace contaminated, just in the normal course of business, whether it's in the IV hood or in the patient care area. If it actually has drug left in it, and we just tell them, if you can see drug, it's not empty, because trying to tell them 3%, and that whole thing just doesn't work well. If there's any drug that you could pull up out of there that you have not, that's not empty, should go in the black container. If you've anything that's overtly contaminated, you spilled on the gown or whatever, or there is a spill that you've cleaned up, that spill goes in the black container. Those are some of the big shifts in practice that they have to train both pharmacy and nursing on. Definition of empty, I don't have to tell you folks what it is, but we do help people understand, the P-listed triple rinsing. And then for you and for the characteristic waste, we do mention that you have to remove all the contents that can be removed through normal means and no more than 3% left. Now, pharmacy kind of got off track about 10, 15 years ago when somebody forgot the first part of the definition and said, as long as you only have 3 cc's left, you're fine. And you might run into that, or maybe 5 cc's or 10 cc's. It keeps morphing. It's like an urban legend. So what we're trying to help them understand is first you have to empty it. Then you can have 3% left. And it does apply to the tubing, the IV tubing. There might be some still caught in there. So that's another little subtlety that we had to work with. And then we mentioned already that residues in syringes are out of regulation if the syringe has been used. So that's helpful, both federally and in California. I'm only bringing this up because if you happen to be in a hospital that we've worked with as pharmacology, we have a proprietary grouping that we call Pharm-E Hazardous. Other companies may call it something else, but it's really trying to come up under the drugs that kind of got left behind because of RCRA not being updated. So we put chemotherapy in there. We also put EPA-regulated pesticides, like lindane would have been in there, or permethrin, another one that's used for licensed scabies. Iodine-containing products coming out of radiology, because some of the non-hazardous incinerators really can't handle that. They don't like the purple plume. Pressurized aerosols, again, because of the incinerator problems. And then poisons, kind of from a DOT perspective. So you may see in some of our folks that we work with this category. It's non-RCRA. It's higher level than non-RCRA Cal. Okay, so it's really going in the black hazardous waste containers, even though it's not regulated that way technically. Okay, our next challenge. The most hazardous pharmaceuticals, those with an LD50 of 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight are, now this is really getting RCRA nerd, right? We're really getting, because we didn't talk about this. So let's see how many of you live and breathe RCRA. Oh man, our response rate's going down. Come on, people. There, now we're coming up. Okay. Okay, P-listed, that's absolutely right. That is the definition of P-listed is 50 milligrams per kilogram oral lethal dose. And what drove me nuts when I got into this 20 years ago, we have drugs like colchicine that meet the definition and aren't listed. So they're not P-listed. So that made me crazy. But it's a subtle thing, but at least it's definitive. Okay, satellite and storage accumulation. What we tell our clients is that their RCRA hazardous waste has to be dated at the time they put the first drug into the container. That's a California rule, not a federal rule. So that's a change from what we would tell other folks around the country. Total storage time in, or I should say it differently, total time in storage accumulation is 90 days, if you're LQG, I should mention, large quantity generator. Total accumulation time at all is 1 year. Now, obviously, if you're small quantity, you'd have 180 days, and you'd have a total of a year. But what's different for the client is knowing that they have to get it out of there within 1 year of the date they start it, which is a little different, you know, from around the country. So that's important to help them understand. And then Mike had started this whole discussion around the Medical Waste Management Act. There's a few things that are awkward in that. Calling them biohazardous was probably unintentionally not a real good idea, because for the rest of the world, biohazardous means potentially infectious. Syringes, you know, dripping squeezable blood, all that good stuff. So from our perspective in healthcare, this was like, wait a minute, these drugs aren't biohazardous. Well, they are by definition. So it would have been nice to just say, you know, non-cal hazardous or something like that. Be that as it may, that's what exists today. As Mike mentioned, anything that's not RCRA and not radioactive falls into that. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Even though the senator was very well intentioned, the idea that you're going to be able to figure out which drugs are non-RCRA hazardous compared to non-hazardous doesn't work. The definition, as you know, is so broad, we'll go into that in a minute, it's impossible for pharmacy or anybody else in healthcare to figure that out. So essentially, our clients are going to manage it as RCRA hazardous, probably put the pharmacy hazardous in that RCRA hazardous category, manage the rest of the drugs as non-RCRA hazardous. So it's black or white, because once you get beyond that, you know, it just gets tough. So there's really no good way to discern that, and they're regulating at a higher level, so it doesn't hurt, you know, from your perspective. And those, of course, go to a regulated medical waste incinerator. These are the definitions, if you haven't looked at them lately. LD50 of 25 milligrams per kilogram or less would make it non-RCRA hazardous. Then you start getting into the acute aquatic 96-hour test, but then you get into carcinogenicity, acute toxicity, chronic toxicity, bioaccumulative, persistent in the environment. I'm not going to make that decision. I don't know that anybody's got the data to make that decision, that it's not that, because it's so incredibly broad. So that's okay. I think we just have to understand all drugs should either be in the RCRA or in the non-RCRA has. And that's basically what folks are doing. Department of Public Health does prohibit sewering and landfilling of the non-RCRA hazardous drugs, which is essentially everything else. So typically they will, the hospital will sort into a white and blue container. They might have a different color, but that's kind of been the standard. It has to be labeled incinerate only, and I'll tell you a little bit about a shift in that in just a moment. And then disposed at a regulated medical waste incinerator in accordance with the Medical Waste Management Act. Okay, this is going to see how your recall is, because this goes back to that definition of hazardous. So let's try this one and see how we do. What's that? Oh, true or false? True. Sorry, thank you. Whoops, slipped up on my ed psych there. That was not fair, because I didn't tell you which way to go. So nobody's going to get dinged on that one. But the actual answer I was looking for was the bottom one, not regulated federally as hazardous, but is recommended as a best management practice. So you did great intuiting what the answer to that should be. Okay, now here's something that just happened. AB 762, it's a medical waste law amendment, which will now allow syringes, sharps, let's put it that way, sharps, because not all syringes have needles anymore, but needles essentially, to be placed into the, let's say, white, non-RCRA hazardous and shipped with them. In the past, you could not put a needle and syringe in with your non-RCRA drug waste. So what this is allowing folks to do is combine them and have fewer containers in some areas. And it has to go, it's a little different now, must be labeled with the biohazard label, which it would have to have anyway for both of those. And then it can either have the word high heat only or incineration only. It doesn't have to have both. This literally just happened a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of memos back and forth. How many of you were involved in that discussion? Anybody get involved in that? Maybe more at the medical waste side. But some people thought you had to have high heat only. Others said, no, you don't have to. So it finally came out, you don't have to. But it normally will go to a regulated medical waste facility. The high heat really refers to either pyrolysis, I almost said paralysis, pyrolysis units, you know, the gasification type plants, or some very high level incinerators. But most of those either don't exist at this time or don't take biohaz. So long story short, it just lets them put syringes with needles into the drug waste container, which they could not do before. So that's basically now. Sewerable 7, one of our clients coined this term. We thought it was a nice one to share with you. Items that can go down the drain. This came out of Jack McGurk's memo some years ago. Dextrose, which of course is sugar. Saline, salt. Sterile water. Lactated ringers, which is also salt. Potassium, calcium, and magnesium salts. These are electrolytes, kind of general body fluids. The sewer system can handle those. So this is the list that most people feel comfortable with in California that can go down. So we'll do this one. This one should be easy because we just did it. Which of the following can be disposed of down the drain? Select all that apply and press send. That's the only hard part here. Gives you extra time when you have to press send. Oh, all right, 99%. You are the 99% out there. You can occupy the Hyatt, right? Very good. That's great. Drug Enforcement Administration. How many of you have had any experience either with DEA or with controlled substances? Not personally, you want to ask that, but in terms of helping someone regulate controlled substances? Got a few of you? Yeah, you know how hard this is. Drug Enforcement Administration obviously regulates and enforces the Controlled Substances Act. Drugs of abuse are assigned to one of 5 schedules. Schedule 1 are illegal substances, which include heroin, methamphetamine, and in the rest of the country, medical marijuana. So I know you have a little different situation here. Schedule 2, so we don't worry about those generally. Schedule 2 are legitimate drugs that have a very high abuse potential, like OxyContin, Demerol, Vicodin, the drugs you hear about, oxycodone, that you hear about being abused on a routine basis. So they're very adamant about controlling those. Schedules 3 through 5 are schedules of decreasing abuse potential. Your tranquilizers like Valium would be in there. Schedule 5, for example, might include Robitussin with codeine, which I could use right now. So those are decreasing levels, but they're still can be abused. And then a drug like propofol, which is not yet on the DEA list, but it's on the watch list, so to speak, because of the Michael Jackson thing. I don't know why anybody would want to take somebody that killed somebody, but that one is being managed as a controlled substance in a lot of states and by a lot of hospitals, just because they've had problems with it. So the disposal is very difficult because the DEA requires it to be rendered non-recoverable, and that has to be witnessed by 2 healthcare professionals. So the traditional ways are down the drain or at an incinerator, but that was when we had backyard burners and we could go out in the back and watch it burn. That doesn't happen anymore. So really, from a DEA perspective, unfortunately, down the drain is still kind of the accepted practice. Now, I know that that's a difficult situation here, because DHS or DPH kind of beat me about the head on that one too. No controls down the drain. One of the hospitals in San Diego had a horrible time where one part of DPH told them one thing and the other part that does controlled substance told them something else. So as Mike mentioned earlier, the hospitals are really caught between a rock and a hard place here, and they have a lot of trouble, I hate to say it, with diversion. The OR is an interesting area. A lot of fentanyl patches, where are they going when they're used? They still have a lot of drug in them. So, I can't really tell you which way to go with this. I think it depends on the philosophy of your CUPA and how you're going to work with them. Legally, as I understand it, if they get permission from the POTW, the local POTW, they could still drain it. That was the caveat on that. What I had suggested last year in San Diego is the Washington State option, which they're very green also. They are allowing hospitals to put very small amounts down the drain up in the nursing unit, like 2 cc's, whatever, from the syringes. They're requiring the larger amounts to go back to pharmacy, like 50 cc's of morphine, and be reverse distributed. It can go back to a reverse distributor. It is expensive. There's a lot of work involved. It's called a transfer between DEA registrants, a lot of paperwork. But those are some options. So I'm not going to be the one to tell you folks how to manage that. Yeah?
But if it's a waste, how can it go back to reverse distribution?
That's the only exception, is the controlled substances. What we had done in Wisconsin, we got a permit from the DNR, a solid waste permit, to take controlled substance waste only. So they can check with their reverse distributor. But that is the only exception, yeah. And it's because most of it's not hazardous either. Okay, let's keep, yeah? Solidifying agent, folks, we have a gentleman out there with the Smart Sink who's done a great job. Our only concern is DEA has not signed off, so it's going to depend on the local DEA inspector. So I would recommend they contact the local DEA and see if they'll go along with it. If they'll go along with it, they're probably good. But so far, Washington's refused to give an opinion. So we talked about that. You know all about hazardous waste generation status. The thing that's been difficult, as you know, is the P-listed waste, less than or equal to 1 kilogram, keeping, or more than 1 kilogram, making you a large quantity generator. The difficulty is documenting it. Now, one thing, so one way to do it is you separate all your wrappers and any other P-listed waste, and you weigh them all every month and you add it up. That's not trivial when you're talking about a big facility. What the memo from EPA did is said, hey, you only have to count the residue. We think the residue is this tiny little amount. If you look at your dispensing records and simply add those up, we'll accept that. I think California, from what I understand, is moving in that direction. When I tried to pin EPA down and say, are these the amounts, they kind of waffled and said, well, that's just an estimate from one hospital. So we do have some big hospital groups that are getting together, and they're going to literally weigh and rinse every single item and have EPA pass on it and then publish it. So I think that'll be more definitive. But again, stay tuned from your state level, because Wisconsin has said we're going to accept a calculation based on that, whether the EPA does or not. So, you know, this is interesting, and it'll continue to be interesting. Obviously, you know, your conditionally exempts aren't excluded from manifesting and reporting, so you're a little tighter there. I think I talked about that. The other one is, of course, not accumulating more than 1 kilogram at any given time. But if we go to the residue thing, we won't have a problem with that. You've probably seen this before. This is typically what it might look like for a hospital that's collecting the non-RCRA has in the white and the RCRA has and whatever else, like the chemos in the black. It can add up pretty quickly. This one in the middle was actually a 600-bed hospital in Minneapolis, so they had quite a bit of waste being generated. One of the big breakthroughs in the last 10 years was when DOT lifted a weight restriction on what they call their waste medicine category. So what this has allowed us to do is not have to segregate the toxics from the flammables, because that was a big deal 10 years ago. Now you've got another container. So in this case, what we do is find out what the hospital's carrying, do a waste profile with all the waste codes, and put all the compatibles together, which is essentially all the P's and U's and D's, including ignitable, except for oxidizers or corrosives or aerosols, and call it waste medicine, liquid, flammable, toxic. And that is a shipping name under DOT that works really, really well, because you can reduce the number of containers that you're required to have. So that's been a huge help for folks, and that's basically what we train on now. So let's take a quick overview. I've been talking about these colors, and in retrospect, I probably should have showed you this slide about an hour ago. The black is for hazardous, the white is for non, the yellow is trace chemo, the red is biohazardous. How many of you have seen these out in the field? Where you've been? Okay, so this isn't really new information. That's good. This is the same waste chart, just did it a little bit differently. And what we use it for, and I know you can't see it all from here, we use it to actually explain that this isn't as bad as it seems. Because the first reaction is, I can't do this. So what we're showing them is that they've already got the red, they've already got the gray solid waste, they've got the blue sewer system. If they're treating chemo, they've got the yellow. They might not have been putting the right thing in it, but they've got the yellow. We segregated out the sharps from the soft stuff, like the gowns and the gloves, because they can save a lot of money having a hamper, a trace chemo hamper, instead of putting them in a sharps container, because those sharps are not cheap. So something you might want to do to encourage them and help them save money is recommend they get a hamper for their soft items that are trace contaminated. And the other thing that happens, when they put them into the red or the yellow sharps, they push them down. And then you can get needle sticks doing that because there's needles in there. So it's nice if they're big enough, it pays to segregate. So what we basically tell them is all you're adding is the black, which is 2 of them, compatible hazardous waste, that's that waste medicine DOT shipping name, and aerosols, and in this case the white and blue, which is actually, I should have called that non-RCRA hazardous, because that's what it would, this is what it would be in the rest of the country, but that's your non-RCRA or California hazardous. Now the change with the new law is that the syringes could also go into that white container if they label it accordingly and so forth. So it's really not so bad, I think, when you spell it out. And what people do is they take this chart, they manipulate it, they make it smaller for nursing, make it more simple for nursing and so forth, and just give people a visual on which way they want to go with it. So I think I've gone through all this already. I talked about the controlled substances. What we've done is encourage them in the pharmacy to put, oh, did you have a quick question?
Yeah. Has anyone given an opinion of how this might apply to manufacturers of electronic cigarettes?
Yeah, and I forgot to repeat questions, which I was supposed to do. The question was, how does this apply to manufacturers? Manufacturers are usually held to a higher standard because they've got process wastes, they know more about their product, they've got a limited number of products. So
specifically, the manufacturers of electronic cigarettes.
I don't know about electronic cigarettes.
They're using
Yeah.
pure nicotine and making their solutions.
Yeah. It's about electronic cigarettes. I would assume in their process they're generating a lot of P-listed nicotine waste, and I would assume that they would need to be following the hazardous waste rules about any waste. When it gets out in the public, it's no longer regulated. So, yeah. Okay, so if we look at then the two primary new waste streams, we've got the hazardous pharmaceutical waste. I'm going to have to keep going. We'll get questions in a little bit. And what we recommend is in the pharmacy, they actually put a sticker on the shelf labels, and we've actually designed, through another company, some stickers that have a white P on it, some that are strictly black stickers, and maybe some of you have seen that. I think some of the hospitals in California are already doing it. It actually was developed by a hospital here in California. And that way they can identify for pharmacy staff which drugs need to go in the black. We also have an arrow sticker for aerosols. That works great in the pharmacy because you've got shelves, you've got places to label, you can pull off of that. It's a great training tool. When you get up into the nursing unit, that's where it gets difficult. So what they have to do there is find as many ways as possible to inform nurses about which way to dispose. And now that they're becoming more and more electronically sophisticated, they can put it into what's called the automated dispensing machines. Common names for that are Pyxis, Omnicell, Accudose. How many of you have seen or heard those names? Anybody? Those are the big machines that stand in pharmacy and up in the nursing unit that contain all the drugs. And the nurses have to scan their badge and whatnot to get the drug out. So they can put a pop-up on there. They can put a little, like P listed in the warfarin cube where they put warfarin. They can also put a message on what's called the electronic medication administration record, where they can, when they give the drug, if they have the computer in front of them, which many of them do now, they can actually see a message there. So the toughest part is informing nursing on which way to dispose of these without detracting from their patient care area. The controlled substances, we've talked about that, remains problematic, and that's probably going to be case by case depending on your regulatory scenario. So black is for the RCRA has and the PharmE has. The non-RCRA has would be incinerate only and go out to a regulated medical facility. The trace chemo will have no bulk chemo in it, bulk being a highly technical term to mean non-RCRA empty, but most people can relate to that in the community. And they go to the regulated medical waste incinerator also. And most of there are a few drugs that are actually biohazardous that really are potentially infectious. And that includes Flumist, the inhaled, it's a live virus vaccine, the inhaled vaccine, and then any other live vaccines or any blood products like albumin. Now, the interesting thing is, in the infection control world, the containers that held those would be considered still biohazardous because you've not cleaned them or anything. So that really doesn't get dealt with under your regs, but that is what we recommend, that either the items in there or the container go into the red container. These usually get autoclaved and not incinerated, which is another reason why we don't want nurses putting drugs in the red containers anymore. They used to get burned, they don't get burned anymore, but a lot of them still, especially the older nurses, believe those are being incinerated. And that's kind of the myth that's been perpetrated through no fault of anyone's. Okay, so non-RCRA hazardous pharmaceutical waste should be disposed of in which container? '81, they're doing good. Okay, the blue and white, that's correct. That's your California hazardous in the vernacular. They can go in the black, nothing wrong with it, but the most cost-effective way to do it is in the blue and white. So very good. Another question. How do you like that? See, we're getting to the end now, so we want to keep you engaged, as they say. Which of the following can be disposed of with regular solid waste? Select all that apply and then press send. So what can you throw out in the trash? So fast, we could have cut the time down on this. The learning curve. Okay. Yep, that's right. Most of the packaging bottles and cans and so forth. Now, Mike had mentioned earlier that if a drug was non-RCRA and non-RCRA hazard, or not RCRA and non-RCRA hazardous in California, you could put it in the trash. We don't recommend that even if you did know what they were, because people can pull things out of the trash. So there's a diversion issue. So this is kind of the intersection between like your state boards of pharmacy, DEA, those folks, along with the hazardous waste piece of it. So we don't even recommend, quite frankly, that a morphine vial be put in the trash, because creative people take that, fill it with something else, and sell it on the street. So we recommend those actually go in the red sharps, not because it's a law, but just because it's probably good practice. Now, I think I've spent enough time on some of this. Let's just see if there's anything we haven't done yet. We've talked about aerosols, and we've talked about the compatible RCRA hazardous waste, bulk chemo, spill cleanup, Pharmy hazardous, all going in the black. We've talked about the chemotherapy waste going in one of two, either the soft ones going in the hamper or the sharps going into the sharps container, and those going to regulated medical waste. We've got the non-RCRA haz going in the white and blue. Some people have blue and white, doesn't matter. Sharps can now be included, going to the regulated medical waste incinerator. You'll see there's a difference in the ash disposal. The ash from the TSDF is going to go to a lined hazardous waste landfill. The ash from the other facilities is going to go to a standard landfill. So a little bit of difference there. And biohaz would be your empty syringes, needles, ampules, except chemo. They're going to be autoclaved or microwaved, usually shredded. They go to the lined landfill. And then most of the packaging and so forth can go into the solid waste as long as there's no drugs. And nothing down the drain except the sewerable 7. And we've talked enough, I think, about controlled substances. So that's just redoing our chart. So let's do another one. Black containers are used for which one? Okay, the suspense mounts. All right, 89, that's great. That is exactly right for the RCRA and the Pharmy hazardous. Which of the following can be disposed of with the solid waste? Oh, this is a repeat. We already did this one. We'll go past that. That got in there by mistake. So what are the key implications for hospital staff? They're the folks that have to live with this and make it happen. Pharmacy has the responsibility of doing what you might call an inventory analysis or a formulary analysis and finding out which drugs become a hazardous waste. Most pharmacies are not equipped to do this either in knowledge or in time, so they use outside vendors and consultants, and that's gotten to be pretty standard. And there's a number of us out there now that do that sort of thing. Once they know which drugs become hazardous, under RCRA, they need to find a way to identify that for their staff, and then, even more difficult, identify it for the nursing folks. Nursing has to be highly involved in this. That's where the action is. In hospitals, if you don't have nursing, you don't have anything, because they're the most employees. They're very, very influential. They're also very green, so we try to help them understand why it's important to do this. And then environmental services, who we haven't talked too much about, has a responsibility of moving both the RCRA hazardous and the non-RCRA hazardous, or California has, to the appropriate storage area, which would be either your storage accumulation area for the black, or it could be the regulated medical waste area for the white, because they are considered biohazardous by definition. We don't really see any problem if they were kept with RCRA haz. That's something that you folks can think about. But usually they have more room in their regulated medical waste area, and that's usually where they would put these. Training is going to be essential for all the staff. They don't have to have, like environmental services doesn't need 24-hour HAZWOPER training. They basically need function-specific training. If all they're going to do is move it, and if there's a spill, stop, contain, and call. You don't need to go through, I've had to say, oh, can I get all my people trained? You don't have to train to that level. You don't need HAZWOPER at all, as I understand, unless you're LQG. So those are some of the things that maybe you can help them with to understand what their responsibility is going to really be. These are some of the common EPA violations that have occurred that have been provided, like by Region 2, who was one of the big regions that started on this years ago. Incorrect waste determination, incorrect labeling of a hazardous waste, improper disposal of chemotherapy, probably still going in the yellow, Improper disposal of drugs down the drain, that was the old standard. Missing or incorrect hazardous waste manifests. If they're a small hospital and haven't been used to dealing with hazardous waste, they don't always understand how important it is to get that top copy back within, 45 days? Is it here? I know federally, I think it's 45 days. To help them understand how important it is to keep those manifests in line. Insufficient training, insufficient inspections of the storage area, and improper management of the expired pharmaceuticals where they're sending waste back that they shouldn't. Now, you've got some unresolved issues that you can take home and think about. The first one is this whole issue of the non-RCRA bulk chemicals, which kind of falls through the cracks and isn't really managed overtly by either group. So we're going to recommend that goes in the black. The controlled substances, we've talked about that. Should truly biohazardous drugs be disposed in the red or in the white? Because the white is going to biohaz. So maybe it's simpler to just let those drugs go with the true biohazardous drugs. So that's something that you might want to talk through with your clients. And then the definition of pharmaceutical includes all drugs not regulated elsewhere, whether they are or meet or don't meet the criteria of non-RCRA hazardous. I don't probably have to go through this. This is kind of preaching to the choir here. I think Mike covered that. You folks are the enforcement folks here. So I think in summary, managing pharmaceutical waste in California is complex for the regulated community as well as for yourselves. And hopefully the different agencies can get together and agree on something where the agency does, or the client doesn't have to, or the hospital doesn't have to pick who do they fear the most in terms of who they're going to comply with. So I think we are about done. You have my email here. We'll do questions now. We have about 15 minutes. But if we don't get to your question, then feel free to email me. And I have to put this one up that you turn in your clickers when you leave.